Great. Okay, we have reached critical mass here, so we'll go ahead and get started. And yeah, please continue introducing yourselves in the chat. Thank you everyone for tuning in from all around the world today. I'm excited to welcome you to GFI's webinar on commercial fermentation, opportunities, and bottlenecks. My name is Molly O'Donnell, and I'm the Corporate Engagement Assistant here at the Good Food Institute. I manage the business side of our GF Ideas community of entrepreneurs, investors, and other professionals in the alt protein industry. You can visit gfi.org/community to learn more about the community. The Good Food Institute is an international nonprofit that's developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We identify the most effective solutions, mobilize resources and talent, and empower partners across the food system to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and delicious. Please visit gfi.org to learn more about our work. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. First, the seminar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel shortly after the presentation. A copy of the slides and recording will be emailed to registrants after the presentation. You can also view previous seminars on our YouTube channel. Second, this presentation will include an audience Q&A for the last 15 or so minutes. Please ask your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the seminar, but we will save them to answer at the end. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Mark Warner. Mark is a registered professional chemical engineer and the founder of Warner Advisors, LLC, where he specializes in commercializing first-of-a-kind biotechnologies from benchtop to commercial reality. His primary focus is on cellular agriculture, and he has consulted with over 50 startup companies working to bring novel alternative proteins to commercial scale. In today's seminar, Mark will walk us through the commercial fermentation landscape and outline the process for facility identification, qualification, and contracting. I'll now turn it over to you, Mark.
Great, thank you, Molly. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm excited today to be able to present. Precision fermentation has kind of come out first and foremost in the novel food discussions, and I think it's just a very timely topic with a lot that's going on today. So as far as the presentation today, as Molly said, it'll be about 30 minutes. There will be time for Q&A at the end. And really my objective is to give insight and perspective on the fermentation landscape, both the ability to contract with existing facilities and or potentially build your own facility. And it's what I would like to consider a boots on the ground perspective of somebody who's been dealing in this space for almost 15 years now, both contracting with facilities and building fermentation facilities. I'd like to start with a brief introduction about myself. I am a chemical engineer by background. I've had the opportunity to be involved in $1 billion of advanced biotechnology commercialization projects, actually taking the concepts and getting them into commercial operation. Positions I've held, I was the chief engineering officer in the early days at Impossible Foods during the early stage of heme scale up. I was a senior vice president of engineering with Solazyme, led the design and building of their fermentation facility in Brazil, and also their demonstration scale facility in Peoria, Illinois. So my perspective comes at this both from somebody who's helped design and build these facilities, but also operate them. I'd like to also drop in references to a couple publications I've been involved in recently. One, many of you have probably seen, it's GFI's recent fermentation document that came out earlier this week. I contributed a couple pieces to it, and it's definitely a must read for anyone on this call. The second one is an article I co-authored a few weeks ago in the Digest with another consultant in the industry. We talk a lot, and we've seen what we consider the coming apocalypse with the real lack of commercial fermentation capacity. To say that this has spawned some discussions and some calls from both investors and companies would be a small snippet of what's happened. It's also really emphasized to me how much this is a discussion topic in the industry, and I'll talk later about how this has actually helped me address specific items in here. So I want to kind of step back for 1 second and talk about what I would call the obligatory path to commercial scale. I often hear these all referred to as CMOs and contract manufacturing, and they're really very different. And I think how we address the problem is first to talk about the difference in these and where I see the biggest part of the problem. The first is pilot scale. You'll often hear it referred to as CRO or contract research. It's usually short-term duration, a few months. It's for new processes. It's usually more about showing a proof of concept than actually generating a lot of engineering data that can be used to design a facility. It's also usually fairly small scale. The most common scale you'll see is 10 liter, maybe 250 liter, maybe up to 1,000 liter fermentation type systems, generally under 1.5 meter cubed or 1,500 liter. So now let's talk about scale up or the demo scale facility. This also is short-term duration, a little longer, maybe 3 to 6 months. It's usually a partially developed process. And the purpose at this point is really twofold. One, it's to scale up the technology. It's to get a larger scale to generate enough engineering data to design your commercial plant, but it's also to demonstrate the market. It's where you make enough product to be able to make samples to give to potential offtake clients for them to have enough comfort that your product will sell to where they will sign a binding offtake for your commercial scale facility. It's important to make sure at demo scale both of these are done. Because of that, you need a little larger size, usually in the range of say 1,500 liters up to about 100,000 liters of fermentation. I will note I'm only talking about the fermentation size. You do need a fully integrated process with downstream, but for this, I'm just focusing on the fermentation. Now let's come to the third portion, which is really the focus today, which is commercial scale. Commercial scale is long-term manufacturing. Different than the other two, it's not a short-term operation. It's a long-term operation that's meant to produce the same type of product day after day. And it's the first point that really you expect to be cash flow positive. The process needs to be fully developed, and this is often at very large scale, 100,000 liters or greater. Now, this is really where the biggest problem is in the industry. I won't say that at times pilot and demo facilities haven't been scarce. There's been more supply of them come on, but it's really this commercial scale limitation that's becoming an issue. And I want to talk about it in more detail, and it's a focus of today. In thinking about it, there was a slide from a client I deal with that I think is the best pictorial of this. And this is from BioBrew Venture. They're part of ZX Ventures, which is a subsidiary of AB InBev. Many people saw them in the last few weeks come out with a partnership with Clara Foods. And this was a slide they had that the first time I saw it just highlighted to me what the issue is. We have all these companies in the space, and there's certainly many more than are on here, that are in various states of development, all moving towards this commercial scale that is frankly constrained. And a lot of my talk today is going to put numbers around what that constraint is and why I believe there is really a problem facing the industry. There's been a lot of money that comes into the space, and that's been great. The problem is it's come primarily on the left side of this chart. When I think of companies like Ginkgo and Zymergen, great companies doing great work, they've raised a lot of money, especially in the last month. The problem is it's all on the left side here. It's still in the development side. I think it's great that that money's flowing in, but my argument is we need to see similar resources coming in to solve the capacity constraint, or all these companies are going to be funneling into the same limited capacity. So I want to step back and talk about what's available today. And I'll talk existing facilities first. You'll often hear the term CMO used in the industry for contract manufacturing, but that really, in my mind, is 4 different buckets. It's CMOs, which are large-scale commercial manufacturing facilities that manufacture primarily somebody else's product. Think of, in North America, Fermic, in Europe, maybe Olan. Their base is to manufacture for others. They certainly make their own products also, but they've been there long-term manufacturing for others. There's also large internal manufacturing assets. Think in the US, Cargill and ADM. Say that both of them have a Decatur, Illinois facility, large fermentation facilities, they're primarily internal. They're making their own products. At times, they've done contract manufacturing there for others. In the case of ADM, they also have a facility in Clinton, Illinois, that's primarily set for outside clients. I categorize one of those as CMOs, one of those is internal. It really doesn't matter. I would argue from a standpoint, those 43 facilities that I've tracked, I would argue are the bulk of the contract manufacturing capacity out there today. Now, there are certainly pilots and demonstration scale facilities. I track some of them. I will acknowledge my focus is on the commercial scale, what I'm calling the CMOs and the internals. There's certainly many more pilots and demonstration scale facilities than I track in my database. I have some on here, but there's certainly more. There's a couple things I want to say about these facilities. It's great that they're there and they do wonderful work. The one limitation is most of them, in fact, the vast majority I'm going to show you in a minute, weren't built to make food products. They were built for other ingredients, so they were never really built for the purpose we're trying to make. I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute. The final item I want to talk about is kind of a fit for purpose also with fermentation. I'll have people bring up ethanol, corn ethanol a lot. There's a lot of capacity there. Can it be used for these precision fermentations? My answer is, unfortunately, usually not. There's certainly some rare cases it can, but I don't consider that in my analysis and my database because generally it will not meet the needs of precision fermentation. So that's kind of the current landscape of what's out there today. Let's talk about what the options are to either build your own facility or maybe to take one of these facilities that maybe has fermentation, but not the downstream you need to make it so that it will host your process. I'm going to start on the left side, and I'm going to talk about the Greenfield option. And I want to note that in both Greenfield and Brownfield, I've personally led the design, build, and startup of facilities in both of these spaces. So these aren't just numbers out of a textbook. These are numbers from dealing with people in the industry and having managed projects myself. On the Greenfield side, I would tell you that 30 to 48 months is kind of typical for a large scale commercialization of a fermentation facility. The good news if you're building your own is the fermenters and the downstream are fit for purpose. And I want to talk about what I mean by that. I'll give an example. A company I worked at years ago, we were scaling up our own process. We were using a large contract manufacturing site that had fairly new fermenters, under 10 years old. And they kept telling us, when you build your commercial scale facility, it'll never be as efficient as ours because we've been running ours for so long. When we built our facility and got it up and running, we were seeing productivities and operations probably 10% better. And it wasn't that we were better than the CMO. The difference was their facility had been built to make industrial chemicals. It had been converted for our product. It could certainly host it, but it was never designed for the cooling and the agitation and the things that a purpose-built facility will give you. The pros, it's new. The cons are what I think most of us in the industry know. It's a long timeline and can be a lot of capital, which has kept a lot of these facilities from being built. So let's talk about the retrofit option. This often happens where you'll find either an idled facility or a contract manufacturing site, which has the fermentation you need, but especially since the topic today is food proteins, very often they don't have the downstream recovery process, which for food proteins is quite entailed. It's usually at least half of a new plant cost, if not more. So in this case, the assumption is we're using their existing fermenters. Fit for purpose is going to vary by the previous use, but at least the downstream will be fit for purpose. Now, I'll talk about the money on each. On the Greenfield, new facility, definitely hundreds of millions of dollars. usually depending on size in the 150 million to 400 million range. If you're to do a brownfield where you buy say an idled fermentation site and put your downstream in, you have to buy the fermentation facility, and then you still have to put in the downstream, which is roughly half of the new capital. So while you can save money, it's usually back of the envelope, maybe in the 65% range of a new build. It's certainly a material amount of money, but it's certainly also not, it's not 20% of new. The downside is you're running with dated fermentation, but the upside is it's usually faster and a little less capital. So with that, I want to dig in a little more to kind of what's out there today. And this is where I'm going to give specific numbers on my view on the market. You saw my map earlier. I have 69 sites worldwide I track. As part of my consulting practice, I have a lot of clients who've used me to both help them design facilities and find contract manufacturing. So majority of the sites, at least the larger sites on here, I've interfaced with before. A lot of them I visited. So this is my assessment of both their capabilities and in discussions with them, what their ongoing capacity is. First thing I want to do is start on the left. So if you remember a couple slides ago where I talked about 23 CMOs and 20 internal facilities, of those 43 total commercial fermentation facilities that really, I would say, service the industrial biotech market. What's often referred to in Europe as white biotech, being food and industrial chemicals, not pharma, not biofuels. When I look at those 43 biggest facilities, I break them down this way. Almost 60% were originally built for pharma. Good sites, but as you're going to see in a minute, most of them are pretty old. The fermentation assets are good, but they don't often have the downstream that's needed. Amino acids, chemicals, and food. So you can see that food is currently only about 5% of what these facilities were originally built for. Their ability to service the market, and I think many of them do a wonderful job, is somewhat limited by their original design. So let's move to the chart on the right side. When I look at the kind of the supply that's out there, total available, I come up with about 61 million liters of total capacity servicing both contract and internal fermentation markets I outline. I get that roughly 49 million of that is committed at any time, meaning that they're under long-term contract. They're making products for others. They're making amino acids. They're making enzymes. They're making other products. There's about 12 million liters that on any ongoing time is generally in the market, means they've lost a client and have capacity available, or other transitional things that's kind of the amount today that's generally available. Of the 12 million, 10 million of that is active and available, but really only fermentation with limited downstream. Only 2 million of that total has downstream to make food. My concern with that, we're going to talk demand in a minute, is that's not a lot of fermentation capacity. And there's a lot of up and coming food companies all talking to that same capacity. This is why I'm projecting that the existing capability of what's out there today in available fermentation and downstream capacity to make the food products most people on this call are probably trying to make, I believe it's going to be fully consumed within 12 to 24 months. So let's move over to the demand side that makes me feel that way. So I picked as an example here a recent publication. It was between Blue Horizon and Boston Consulting Group. There's certainly A.T. Kearney's study that was published, I think, 6 months ago. There's plenty of studies out there that show this huge demand coming up. What I liked about the Blue Horizon study is they broke it into plant-based, microbial-based, and cellular-based. I'm going to focus on this middle area, what I see as aquamarine, represented by the 22 on the far right bar. That's what's really coming out of precision and biomass fermentation. So the question is, we're talking millions of metric tons here. What does that mean in fermentation? So if I look at 2025, I actually reached out to the authors, and they were good enough to provide some of the underlying data. The data point at 2025 is 0.38 million metric tons. That's this little blue area I've highlighted. What I want to point out is, depending on whether you're talking precision or biomass proteins and different assumptions, I get that that's in the range of 20 to 50 million liters of fermentation capacity. If you think about my slide a minute ago, I said the whole available capacity today is in the 60 million liter range, and that there's only maybe 2 to 12 million available to do this today. This is why my assertion is, to quote the movie Apollo 13, Houston, we have a problem. We've got all these companies scaling up technologies, and the forecasted demand significantly exceeds supply right now. So let's dig into what that means a little more. The kind of the stark reality of our readiness is, I can't emphasize enough, the sites that are out there are well run. They're journey type facilities. They've produced a lot of good products. Majority of them are 20 to 50 years old. We've seen more of a decline in fermentation at large scale in recent years than addition. And I want to highlight that. I think people think with all these companies coming, there's been all this addition of fermentation capacity. When you look at the millions of liters out there, there's been more big scale facilities come offline than come on, especially for those of us in the US. I've seen more of these facilities come offline than come into service. As I mentioned, they weren't originally designed to make food proteins. They have fairly limited downstream, and the forecasted demand, as I just showed, significantly exceeds supply. So how did we get here? In the article I mentioned about the coming apocalypse, my co-author Chris Gusky had a great quote he put in that was a rewording of Margaret Thatcher's quote on capitalism, or excuse me, on socialism. But it's to say that capital light is great until you run out of somebody else's capital. All the focus of fundraising in recent years around these advanced biotech companies has been in the organism and the process, which is all great. I don't mean to diminish that that is needed, but we're heading to a squeeze here that we need to see a significant increase in capacity, or all these great companies and technologies aren't going to be able to realize what they're planning and produce all those wonderful pounds of products that we all expect to come out to the market. So here's a slide I want to emphasize. What I'll tell you is, I started this presentation over 2 months ago, and I only put this slide in the last few days. And this slide came out of conversations over the last 2 weeks with a handful of investor groups and a handful of large biotech companies that called me based upon the Apocalypse article and said, listen, what does this really mean? You say all this capacity, but how does my individual investment or my company, how do I really characterize how big of an issue they have? And what I've said is, and it started with this graph, so I want to start with the graph. I've helped scale up over 20 precision and biomass protein processes, and especially for the precision proteins, this is not an individual company or process, but it kind of represents a typical precision protein that if I hold for a certain organism, if I hold the key parameters of titer, dextrose cost, recovery yield constant, and I only vary the scale of manufacturing, there is a lot of economics of scale that come at just being very large scale. Most of the industry today, if you're making amino acids at very large scale, or you go to the big agricultural companies that have fermentation facilities, they try and build fermenters in the 500,000 liter range because of the cost efficiencies that come over, say, smaller facilities with 50 or 100,000 liter fermenters. Doesn't mean there's not a purpose for facilities with 50 or 100,000 liter fermenters. It really depends on what your end goal case is. So if you look on the left again, I really break down three cases. I would say for a company or an investor in companies that how much of a concern you should have really depends on which bucket you fall in. The first category is precision proteins that are generally expected. And the one thing I want to point out is look 3 to 5 years from now when you expect to be cash flow positive, making money, and you've hit your business model. That's the point I'm talking about. What scale of fermentation do you expect to be at and what price point? If you expect to be able to be cash flow positive under 100,000 liters, that's usually products that have to be above 150 bucks a kilogram. You know, here I'm thinking of cannabinoids, CBDs, those kind of things. There are certainly things that fall into these categories. And I would tell you, if that's your business model, you're probably okay. There's probably capacity in the near term out there for you. You're going to pay a little higher rate than the economics you would get from a large scale facility, but at your price point, that works for you. The second category is those that need to be in the 100 to 500,000 liter range. And I'm talking total fermentation capacity to support their business model. That's usually represented in the $50 to $150 per kilogram range. I would argue if you're in this category, you need to be concerned. You need to have a plan. You're partnered with somebody to bring capacity online. You're building your own facility. You're already under a long-term contract with an existing CMO. My point is you don't have to have a solution today, but you need to be close and have a plan to get to one. My biggest concern comes from the third category, which are precision proteins that need to be produced above 500,000 liter scale. These are generally the large food proteins and under $75 a kilogram. Again, just because of price point, if you're making a novel protein that's going into food, generally most of those fall in this category. I would argue based on the state of capacity in the market, you need to have an immediate and concrete plan to have capacity. Again, any of those three options, using a existing CMO, partnering with an existing CMO or a company to bring on capacity, or building one yourself, all three of those are credible options. But I would tell you, absent immediate action, you've heard me say, I think the market's going to be out of capacity in 12 to 24 months, and that most of these options will take you, you know, in the range of 18 to 36 months, best case. So with that kind of background, just want to give a highlight, assuming a lot of people here may take this as an impetus, if they haven't already, to kind of go out and start looking for sites. If you're going to go out and look for sites, there are good sites out there, especially if you're on the lower end of the size range. I've done a lot of these searches myself. Clients do them themselves. They hire people like me. Either way, I would tell you, start at the end and work backwards. Look where you need to be 2-3 years from now. Understand what that means in capacity and process. Use that to screen facilities, saying, okay, there's only certain facilities that are that size, and of those facilities, we need these kind of downstream processes to figure out who your best short list is. I would tell you, you need to do everything you can to get down to a list of 2 or 3, maybe 4 as soon as possible. You can't do a deep search with 5 or 7 sites. Each site takes a lot of time and digging and some limited level of process transfer to where you need to get to that short list pretty quickly and try and get someone secured for capacity. So kind of a summary of what I've talked about today. The market is changing daily. I can't emphasize that enough. Just in the last, 6 to 9 months, I've seen sites I've used for years come off the market or be sold. It's very tight, especially in the United States. Most of the bigger producers are looking for long-term manufacturing. They're not looking to do 3 months of scale-up runs. Maybe if you convince them, you're going to be there long-term. And when I say convince, I mean not just a promise, a long-term commitment. You may get some assistance with scale-up, but a lot of these sites don't want to do just the scale-up work. Downstream is a big issue. It's what often limits a lot of these processes and keeps them from reaching their timelines and their cost targets. This capital light strategy, it's gotten a lot of funding into the market, but again, I would argue it's one thing that's going to have to change for the industry to see the gains we all hope it can make. And you know, it's just been, it's great how many new organisms we have coming in, but we have to see that funding also shift to the back end to help get it to commercial reality. With that, I'll hit my last slide. I did want to highlight, I published a book a couple years ago for those new to advanced biotechnology. It's targeted at really finance and non-technical people who are new to the space that want to understand the difference between a bubble column or an agitated fermenter and why is fermentation or downstream so important. It talks about a lot of the technical topics, but in a manner, hopefully, that a lot new to the industry can use it to become more familiar. So with that, I will appreciate your time and we'll pass it back to Molly for question and answer.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark, for that value-packed presentation. I know I learned a lot. So now we will turn it over to audience Q&A. So as a reminder, please ask your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. And thanks for the folks who have been asking questions throughout the presentation. It was definitely really engaging. So first question here. Where do people scale up to? Contract manufacturers? Are you seeing more startups renting out space versus purchasing a bioreactor? And I know this is also something that you addressed in your previous Business Evolved Protein seminar in September. So I would encourage whoever asked that question, check that out on our YouTube channel. But I don't know if you wanted to say a few words about it here.
Either of those are good options. I will tell you, below probably 300 liters, most of the companies start, at least initially, universities, national labs. There's a lot of good resources out there. I often find once they raise the money, they often try and bring it in-house just because they have a little more control. But I think either of those are certainly good options. It often really comes down to funding, whether they want their own capital or using universities and existing labs.
Absolutely. Thanks. Okay, next question. Where do you normally do R&D data collection? Do you work with universities or labs, or could you pull back the curtain on that process?
Yeah, I mean, that's the scale up we talk about. The whole idea is when I say scale up, you're going to run your fermentation to find out how long is it, how much raw material does it take, you know, what do I need to do to optimize it? Same with the downstream. When we say the term scale up, it's that data collection. I will tell you, the universities are really good at it. That's one thing to consider when you start going to these bigger facilities. The more they're used to doing manufacturing, the less they may be used to doing as much data analysis and gathering, because they're used to making the same product every day, not necessarily doing R&D. So it's certainly something that you should consider, but all of them are options. I, especially in this constrained world, don't want to tell you one's your only option. I think I've seen people both succeed and maybe wish they had done something different using both of those.
Gotcha, thanks. Yeah, sounds like there are definitely pros and cons to each, something to really consider. Moving on to another question. We actually got quite a few questions about the CMO scene in Asia. I'm not sure if you have any info to share on Asia, India as well.
No, I appreciate that. I meant to cover that on that slide and forgot. You probably noticed Asia's not on my slide, and there's a reason. Generally, I've been doing this for almost 15 years now, especially in the food space, right or wrong. US and European companies don't generally manufacture food products in Asia. Most of that's China, but they certainly have big fermentation facilities. I have tried to do, and again, I want to emphasize, I'm focused at the large facilities, 500,000, million, 2 million liters. You'll certainly find some smaller facilities. There's at least one, if not two, that have come online in India recently that I know people are using, but they're smaller scale. When I talk the large scale, I generally have not seen the ability of clients to go at large scale into Asia. So that's why you are correct. My area is focused mainly on North America, Europe, South America, and some around the world.
Great, thanks. Next question, great question here from Jennifer. Considering the growth of demand you mentioned and we're seeing for alternative proteins, what do you think is keeping more CMOs from being built, or is this a trend that's really starting? If you could say a bit on that.
You know, it's the chicken or the egg, unfortunately. And I've been involved in 3 or 4 projects that have considered this. And think of it this way. You're a startup company and you want to scale up your process at this new CMO. There's been ones that have in the US and Europe that have tried to do this. Here's the model. They want to build this facility. It's going to cost a couple $100 million, but they need debt to do it. So to get fundraising to do it, assuming they can't get a government loan, which hasn't been out there, they have to have some kind of credible counterparty, meaning they have to get somebody to sign a contract saying, yes, in 2 years, when your facility's built, we'll contract with you. Most of the companies out there are having to raise money every year to 2. So even if it's the big players, the Ginkgos, the Zymergens, the Impossibles, if you're taking 3 years to build a facility, the debt holders looking at that funding are saying, hey, this is dependent upon that counterparty being there who has to raise money again. Am I saying it can't work? It hasn't so far. The problem is everyone wants these large facilities, but no one's wanted to put the capital in. And it's been hard. I've sat in the rooms with the people looking at putting the capital in, and it's like, well, if there's really that many people that need it, somebody should be willing to step up. You know, the other question is to the CPG companies, if you're planning on these novel ingredients 3, 4, 5 years from now, you may need to sign a contract for that. That's something that could make it financeable to where there's at least an offtake contract where they know if they run the facility to make the product, it will be sold. I joke, everyone wants to get debt. I've done a lot of equity and debt financing. Problem with the debt people, when a bank lends you money, they actually expect to get all their money back, where the venture capital groups are about trying to get 10 or 20x return. And if 1 or 2 of the investments don't turn out as well, they're okay with that. But the debt side wants to see a return.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that. And kind of piggybacking off of that, if you could, and I know you kind of touched on this in the previous question, but anything else you could say on the biggest cost drivers behind the capital investment?
Biggest cost, I mean, it's the facility, it's the equipment and the fermentation. I mean, the numbers I put out there, you know, roughly half that cost is going to be the front end fermentation. You're talking fermenters, air compressors, you know, all the different equipment. Same with the downstream. The thing that's really interesting, and I see a question here, and it's a good question on lysine and MSG and how is that price point so much lower. It's 2 reasons. At least what I've seen, the productivities of those organisms are much higher. They can put out much higher productivity of product per unit fermentation, which is where I think a lot of the industry hopes to get. And they've also been able to build them at very large scale.
Gotcha, thank you. Just getting ahead of these questions here. Oh, another related question for that. If you could talk a bit about how the Capex for precision fermentation might differ against maybe traditional fermentation.
It depends what you mean by traditional fermentation. So if I take the 3 buckets, precision and biomass fermentation. So if I think precision, I think, you know, Clara's protein, Perfect Day, Impossible's heme, that's precision. When I think biomass, I think the corn product, you know, a solid product. When I think traditional, I'm thinking tempeh and yogurts and things. They're completely different. I will tell you, well, the traditional is completely different. I will tell you much of the fermentation equipment, the actual fermenters between biomass fermentation and precision are fairly similar. The amount of product you get out of them is very different. Since it's a whole, think of it this way, I'm growing the organism. Is my product a protein that gets secreted into the broth, or is it the whole organism? If it's the whole organism, I make a lot more product per unit fermenter than I do with a precision protein. So the fermenters look a lot the same. The downstream is very different. For a lot of these wholesale proteins, they're dewatered and dried. For the precision proteins, which have a much higher, and I think that was part of the question earlier, why a lot of those precision proteins had such a high cost point. It's just you're having to grow a lot of organism to make what's a relatively small amount of product out of the same manufacturing facility.
Gotcha, thanks. And that also kind of leads right into another question and kind of trying to thematically group questions here. So we had a few about downstream processing. If you wouldn't mind maybe giving an overview and some examples. Sure. There was some confusion there. And then while you're there was another question about the most constrained downstream capacities that you see.
Sure. I would encourage anyone with that question to go look at the previous version of this I did with GFI about 2 or 3 months ago, because I talk about it in real detail. But basically, if I look at precision fermentation, where I'm growing an organism and I'm secreting some novel protein, again, it's casein or heme or something like that. It's generally, the process is pretty similar. It's aseptic fermentation. It's cell removal with something like a distack centrifuge. It's usually a cleanup step with a microfiltration, and then what I would call a backstop with ultrafiltration. These proteins are almost always purified by their size. You'll hear this, they're 20 kilodaltons, 50 kilodaltons, 80 kilodaltons. That's the size of the protein. And you basically, what I like to say is, in many ways, the downstream is like sorting rocks. You have different screens and you hold the big rocks up top, you let the little rocks through, and you want the medium-sized rocks. Then the question is spray drying. So to talk about it again, fermentation, centrifugation, microfiltration, ultrafiltration, and spray drying. I've probably described 25 of the leading precision protein companies in the space. Their IPs around the organism, the cutoff point of their microfiltration, the ultrafiltration, and the technology they use for drying. Generally, the biggest constraint, most fermentation facilities, a distack centrifuge is almost always an appendage generally to a big fermenter. It's usually the microfiltration, the ultrafiltration, and especially the spray drying. Those are the three that are the most limited, and they can be difficult for many sites to install because they handle a lot of water compared to what facilities are used to, compared to other processes. And the drying is just very big. I mean, these spray dryers can be, commercial spray dryer, 120 feet tall, 25 feet in diameter. They just take a lot of space. So that's often been, those are the limitations I run into the most, is the filtration and the drying.
Gotcha, thank you. So next question here. So given the bottleneck that we discussed a little earlier, where do you see the likely investment for increased capacity coming from? Do you see maybe governments taking a role, other organizations? Are there alternatives to debt financing and venture capital that companies could look into?
Yeah, I mean, it's, my hope is all of the above. I was in the biofuels wave for good and bad. There's things we did right and there's things we did wrong. But a lot of that was pushed by government funding. You could also argue that it caused some overbuilding potentially. But I think governments need to, and I'll speak to my own country and continent now, the US needs to understand we're losing this battle. First thing, when I do a contract manufacturing search for any client over 100,000 liters, I tell them is, assume you're going to Europe. There's a couple sites here in the US, but there's way more capacity and things in Europe. And if that's going to change, there's going to need to be investment here in the United States. I'm hoping some of that comes through governmental sources. I think there are some big players. I think there are players who will enter the space, but nobody's going to build a facility without a binding commitment. I want to come back to this counterparty. If I'm looking somebody in the eye and telling them I need $200, $300, $400 million, they need to understand the revenue source where that's coming from. If it's a company, they need to understand their long-term, their funding and where they're going to be 2 or 3 years from now. Or if it's a CPG, they need a binding take or pay contract. Those are the things I think they're going to have to start emerging to be able to build more of these facilities.
Sounds good, thanks. And kind of a related question, do you see any opportunities for pooled resourcing between startups to build capital? So startups potentially collaborating on a facility, is that something you find?
Not yet. I'll tell you personally, I pitched that to some groups of VCs 4 or 5 years ago saying, this is something many of us have been talking about for a while, talking about, hey, you're invested in these startups. Each one of your startups is contracting with somebody or looking to build a facility. Should you consider, funding a facility to preferentially host your companies and then maybe others? It just is, the problem is it doesn't fit the standard venture capital model. They want 10 or 20 or 30 to 1 returns, potentially they want that business case. It's hard to do that with spending large capital, and I understand that, but I would argue it's going to be hard for them to monetize all these great technologies if there's no place to manufacture it. You can't sell a product that's not manufactured.
Yeah. So next question here, also kind of related. Someone asked you to talk about the difference between the equipment and facilities required for cultivating meat and the equipment for fermentation. And do you see any opportunities for instance, a hybrid plant that could combine these two technologies in one facility?
Sure, potentially. I mean, cellular meat and cellular fish and things all come out of biopharmaceuticals where they've been growing animal cells for a long time, but not for the cells. They grew the cells, they made them to be adhered, they did it to make different vaccines. Now we're trying to adapt that technology. I think people who haven't been doing it as long and have as much gray hair, unfortunately, as I do, don't realize there were people, 30 years ago questioning whether E. coli fermentation could ever be done above 50,000 liters. It's done at 600,000 liters now. So the farm has always been the tip of the sword. The question is, can you make those economical at larger scale? I think this applies to cellular meat. I've worked for a handful of companies. I think they aspire to be at larger scale in fermentation that looks more like large scale microbial fermentation. I think a lot of their abilities to hit the price points they want to be at will be how well they can prove things out along that pathway to run an equipment that looks more like microbial fermentation and less like traditional cellular pharma equipment.
Great, thank you. And now I've just been going through these questions and kind of seeing common themes. So I'd like to pause to address just a few questions that we got. One, there was some confusion about the 3 different production platforms of alternative proteins. So I just thought we could do kind of a super quick primer. And then you're obviously welcome to read more on the GFI website. So when we talk about plant-based meat, we're talking about meat that is made from plants. Cultivated meat is meat that is actually grown from cells. So it's basically culturing the animal cells so that they grow into format. And then fermentation, finally, which is really the subject of this presentation, is really taking microbes to basically transform a food product. And there are 3 different subcategories of fermentation that we've been focusing on. So I'll definitely send out the fermentation report later on. And we'll also send out the link to Mark's previous webinar, which we also got a few questions about. So just wanted to kind of quickly make that clarification because I know that we did get a few questions about it. So hopefully that's helpful for folks, and you can read more on gfi.org. Definitely encourage you to dig into all the resources that will be coming after the presentation. But moving on to another question, and this is a really specific question, Mark. So if you can't answer it, maybe just whatever else you can say on kind of the price parity cost side. But the question is, how many liters of precision fermentation milk would need to be produced at a CMO to be competitive with animal milk?
I don't know off the top of
Yeah.
my head,
I know
unfortunately.
it's a specific
Well, the answer I can give you is likely over a 500,000 liter. It's going to have to be at that kind of scale.
Mhm.
You know, the one thing I would add is, first, to kind of editorialize on what you said, we have all these different categories. And one thing I preach as somebody who's held some senior positions in a lot of these different companies is we need all of them. You know, we need to train our fire outside the industry, not at each other. If you want to eat a plant-based burger, a precision burger, drink your, you know, an almond milk versus a casein, those are all good products. The role of precision fermentation to some degree is what I'll say, you bring it in for functionality. It's to take agricultural materials that might otherwise not have as much functionality and make it be more like, quote, the real thing. Some people want that, some people don't, but that's each one of these, you know, we're not going to solve the problem of, you know, global warming and replacing the use of animals with one of these. We need all of these.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a ton of potential for combining different production platforms. And, you know, maybe someday there will be a plant-based burger and it will have cultivated fat in it that will help give that, you know, juicy, fatty taste or whatever. So yeah, I think there's more than enough room for all the production platforms. So thanks for adding that comment. Moving on to another question here. So someone asked about fermentation capacity. They said, what is the typical fermentation duration in that model? I'm actually not sure if you knew what model they were referring to. We could ask
that was a secreted precision fermentation. I'd have to go back. It was probably in the range of 96 to 120 hours. And I'm looking at the comments. I will certainly tell you, remember my premise of this is mid-range. I've seen people, and I believe the models, that can produce these proteins down potentially in the single dollar digits. So this is kind of an average. I've personally been involved in modeling and scaling up processes anywhere from the, you know, $5 a kilogram to $500 a kilogram. They are all possible, because I also did see a note in here that I'm not acknowledging how efficient the organisms can get. And I fully agree with that. That chart I had is representative. You're tighter and everything gets better, that whole chart. My point is the chart moves down. It's still going to be twice as expensive. If you can make it for $5 a kilogram at very large scale, it's going to be 10 or 15 at smaller scale. My point is the whole chart moves up and down. But I agree, there's definitely, I don't mean to give the inference that all these proteins are going to be in the, you know, $20, $30, $40 range.
Mm-hmm. Great. Next question. So we talked a bit about the difficulty with fermentation production capabilities, and someone asked if you have any advice for early stage startups going into precision fermentation if there's not going to be enough capacity by the time they're ready to scale up.
I mean, start having the conversations now. I mean, you know, you can talk to the CMOs, you know, well, the number one thing is understand what you need. Look 3 to 5 years out and say, how much do we need? Do I need 100,000 liters, 1,000,000 liters, or 5 million liters? And understand what that represents in the way of capital, if you build your own, potentially capital or partnership with a, you know, big company that may be interested in your product and willing to partner with you, or going the straight contract manufacturing route. But it's a definite case where you have to know what's ahead of you to plan for it. And it's same with investors. The investor calls I've been giving, he said, how do you think we should view this? And I said, you know, if I were you, I'd be looking at your portfolio saying, each one of these models, when they start being cash flow positive, how much capacity is that? And how much risk, you know, is our portfolio represent 100,000 liters or 10 million liters? If it represents 10 million liters, we probably better be comfortable how that's being addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would definitely also recommend to the person who asked this question to check out Mark's previous webinar with us. I think you'll find a lot of good info in there. So moving on to another question, we actually had a few questions about talent and the people who will be running these fermentation facilities, and that has the potential to be another bottleneck. We'll need bioprocess engineering talent. So I wonder if you've thought about this or have any insights on the talent side of things.
I had a call with a leading company in the space about this the other day, and there's a war for talent. I mean, there's not, nobody's been building facilities for 5, 6, 7 years. So the people who are experienced in that, there's less of them. That said, you do have some time. The facility I built in Brazil 7, 8 years ago, I brought a pretty big team down to help start it up. It gives a lot of people experience. I think we need to continue to do that in the industry. I will tell you, you need your process expertise in-house. Even if you're an early stage company, hire some good, engineers, even if you can't get someone with 20 years experience because they're too expensive for your stage. There's no substitute for homegrown talent. Because as I've built and run these facilities, the other thing is I want people that have ownership. I want people that when we start up the plant feel they not only contributed, but to some degree it was their baby, and that the success of that facility is tied to them personally. There's no motivation as much as that. Everyone sees incentives and stock options and stuff, but in this space, many people are doing it for the right reason, and you want to have that in there.
Great, thanks. And someone asked what is generally done with the remaining biomass for precision fermentation. And this is actually something that we talked about a bit in our fermentation symposium last year. So I would encourage you to check out those recordings. But if you wouldn't mind saying a few words on that, Mark.
Yeah, my answer would be not enough. Precision fermentation wants just what's coming out. Generally, it goes to things like animal feed, which kind of fights part of the argument. You're trying to keep from using animals for commerce, and then that's considered a higher end use. Sometimes it goes to anaerobic digestion. Part of this comes around the GMO question of, what can it be used for? I would tell you, I personally think it's an area, I always hate to use the word, not low hanging fruit, but lower. It's a lot of material. You have to wait till you run one of these material balances and you figure out the precision protein you want is 3% of what comes out of fermentation, and the organism that in theory you're not monetizing as well can be 90-some%. So I definitely think it's an area, because a lot of the organisms are things that look like they go into foods, and I've seen people look at making isolates out of them that can go into burger replicates and things. I think it's an area, it's not my area of personal expertise, but I definitely think it's an area that needs a lot of investigation.
Great, thanks, Mark. And so those are all the questions we'll have time for today. Want to thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with us. So much value, really learned a lot. And as a reminder to our attendees, please be on the lookout for the post-webinar email with the slides, recording, and additional resources, including many of the resources we mentioned in the Q&A. And be sure to check gfi.org/events to stay up to date with all GFI events and other industry events of interest. And if you enjoyed this seminar, you should definitely tune into our State of the Industry webinar series starting next week. We'll discuss the landscape of each sector of alternative proteins. The fermentation one will be on May 25th, and you can sign up for all three if you'd like. And the link to register will be emailed to you after the presentation. So thank you again for tuning in, everyone. Thank you, Mark, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.